I think we see participants, and now maybe we can start. And first of all, I would like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining the press conference of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. My name is Saulia Mohamed Rahimova, and I'm the Commission's media advisor and will be moderating the briefing. The members of the Commission will present findings and conclusions of a new report about Russian forces' drone attacks against civilians in Kherson region. As you may know, the Commission was established by the Human Rights Council in March 2022. It investigates violations and abuses of human rights, violations of international humanitarian law in the context of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. First, we will hear from the commissioners, Chair Erik Møse, Pablo de Greiff, and Vrinda, and then we will open the floor for questions. I want to remind that we have interpretation into Ukrainian, and you can choose and select the language. The other thing what I wanted to remind is that during the conference, you can ask questions either yourself or you can put them or copy them in the place them in the chat. So now I will turn over to Chair Erik Møse for opening remarks. Mr. Chair, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I would like to start by welcoming you to our press conference and thank you for your continued interest in the work of the Commission. We appreciate that our findings and conclusions are disseminated to a wider public. In our new report, which is becoming public today, the Commission has concluded that the Russian forces' drone attacks against civilians in Kherson region on the right bank of the Dnipro River amount to crimes against humanity, war crimes, and terror. The attacks in Kherson city and in 16 other localities under Ukrainian government control, stretching over more than 100 kilometers, have now been going on since July 2024, and it is still continuing. The drone operators used video feeds transmitted in real time by the cameras embedded in the drones, focused on targets that were visibly civilian, and dropped explosives on them. Hundreds of these video feeds have been regularly disseminated on Russian Telegram channels, some of them with thousands of subscribers, displaying the crimes, as well as text posts announcing further attacks. So far, almost 150 civilians have been killed and hundreds more have been injured, according to official sources. The perpetrators used civilian drones that they weaponized to drop explosives on targets. Victims were men, women, and children, mostly men. Civilians were targeted in various circumstances as they stepped out to carry out their daily activities, whether on foot or in any kind of vehicle. The drone attacks have been widespread, systematic, and conducted as part of a coordinated state policy. They followed a regular pattern and the same modus operandi, demonstrating that they were planned, directed, and organized. These and other elements led the Commission to conclude that Russian armed forces carried out drone attacks targeting civilians pursuant to an organizational policy and committed murder as a crime against humanity. I will stop here and leave the continuation to my colleagues.
Thank you, Erik. The individual drone attacks against civilians in Kherson caused deaths, grave bodily injuries, including amputations, cuts, and concussions, and also led to psychological trauma and fear. In September 2024, a woman from Poniativka village and her 54-year-old husband walking home were both hit by a drone explosive. She said, quote, "My husband died in my arms, bleeding to death, because an ambulance did not arrive in time. I tried to stop the bleeding with a t-shirt, but it was not enough." Ambulances, which have special protection under international law, have been targeted and struck by drones so as to prevent them from reaching victims who had been previously attacked. Some of these victims have died as a consequence of not being moved to a medical facility in time. A 44-year-old man from Stanislav village recounted that in November 2024, a drone dropped an explosive near him as he was riding a moped, badly injuring his leg. An ambulance arrived, and while he was receiving first aid, a drone dropped 2 explosives on the ambulance. The use of drones to target civilians and civilian objects is a violation of the fundamental principle of international humanitarian law, according to which attacks may only be directed at military objects. The evidence collected leaves no doubt that the perpetrators carried out these attacks intentionally. The Commission has therefore concluded that Russian armed forces perpetrated the war crimes of intentionally directing attacks against civilians. It also finds that posting videos of civilians being killed and injured amounts to the war crime of outrages upon personal dignity. And I will stop here for my colleague. Thank you. Vrinda, you're muted.
Muted.
Apologies. The Commission further found that Russian armed forces and those supporting them have committed acts or threats of violence for the primary purpose of spreading terror among the civilian population in violation of international humanitarian law. The public dissemination of videos of attacks and threatening texts announcing further attacks in the above-mentioned areas, referred to as the red zone, have exacerbated the fear of the population. One example of a threatening telegram message to the civilian population in Kherson region read, I quote, "Get out of the city before the leaves fall, you who are destined to die." The widespread and systematic character of the attacks, the terror instilled within the population, and the ensuing coercive environment have compelled thousands to flee. In addition to attacking civilian persons, drones have targeted civilian objects and infrastructure, all means of transport, and emergency and rescue services. The damage and destruction of houses, the absence or limitation of services, essential infrastructure, and transport have rendered the affected areas unlivable and left many residents with no other choice than to seek safer locations. In the Commission's view, the conduct of the perpetrators may amount to the crime against humanity of forcible transfer of population. The Commission also examined allegations by Russian authorities of drone attacks by Ukrainian armed forces against civilian targets in Kherson Province. However, it was unable to corroborate them because of the lack of access to victims and witnesses and lack of cooperation by Russian authorities. We end our press statement here.
Well, thank you, commissioners. Now we take questions. Please use the raise hand button if you want to ask your question, or you can copy it and place in the chat. So I don't see any raised hand, at least not on my screen. I see Vasil. Please, Vasil, go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Vasil Korotkий, Ukrainian News Agency, Ukrinform. Commissioner, thank you for this report. I also would like to ask you about the recent large-scale Russian air attacks on Ukrainian cities. Could these attacks also be considered crimes against humanity? And will the Commission investigate these attacks? Thank you.
Maybe I should start and say that if you are now referring to the most recent attacks against the Ukrainian territory, this is, of course, something we are following. This is part of our task to follow the events as they develop, but we have not made any conclusions. We will, as in previous reports, focus also on attacks, including attacks against infrastructure, and assess the evidentiary situation. Needless to say, we are aware of the repercussions by these attacks, but this is not the time when we will make any legal conclusions. We will come back to this.
Well, now I can see in the chat Zarina Zabrisky would like to ask a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, hi. My name is Irina Zabrisky, and I'm a war correspondent for Byline Times and Euromaidan Press. I've been reporting on human safari from Kherson from July 2024, as I was based there most of this time. So I witnessed and documented these drone attacks on civilians. My question is, given the UN's confirmation that these acts constitute war crimes, what concrete steps could follow to ensure accountability?
Maybe I can very briefly answer that question as well, but my colleagues will soon fall in. As you know, the Commission of Inquiry is a fact-finding mission, establishing the facts on the ground, drawing conclusions as to whether there are violations and crimes, and then making recommendations. And the material we are gathering, collecting, is then available for any kind of judicial institution that wants to pursue this. It can be an international institution or a national institution. As you know, there are such proceedings ongoing already, but this is again not the part of this mandate, but of other entities, prosecutors and courts.
Any additional things from other commissioners to this question?
I think that this covers the basics, actually. Perhaps I will add just one point to Vasily's first issue about the most recent attacks. The Commission, as you know, is fact-finding, but it also has a very rigorous methodology in order to reach determination. And therefore, it takes us a while to accumulate the necessary proof to satisfy the evidentiary threshold that we apply in order to reach any determination. And that means that we need some access, we need to interview people, we sometimes need documentary evidence. So it's not reluctance to pronounce ourselves about recent events. It's just that the temporal proximity doesn't allow for the methodology to be applied in the rigorous fashion that we do.
Thank you. So, any other questions? Anyone else? I don't see any other raised hands. So, Vasily,
Yeah,
I raise the hands here.
please,
May I?
Vasily.
I would like to ask, what is the focus of the Commission's investigations under its new mandate after renewal in April?
Maybe here one of my colleagues could contribute so that I don't monopolize the answers.
So every year we have an investigatory strategy. You know that the opportunity costs for choosing particular topics is quite high. The conflict is a complicated one in a large country. The staffing is small relative to the magnitude of the task that we have. So we start each mandate with a notional strategy to help us guide in our investigations. That, of course, is accommodated as facts develop on the ground and also as evidence becomes available or not, and we modify the strategy accordingly. There are some topics that we have not ceased to be interested in and to be and to investigate. All of them are difficult. They include, for example, the attacks on the electrical and thermal infrastructure in Ukraine. This has been a long-standing interest of the Commission. We continue to investigate cases of children transferred to the Russian Federation. We continue to have an interest in issues having to do with the different ways in which the conflict afflicts Ukrainian culture, not just through the destruction, but also through the transfer of cultural objects. And of course, we will continue to investigate the violations of both human rights and international humanitarian law that we have investigated up to this point. And that involves, for example, what you mentioned, the use of weapons with high explosive power. There is absolutely no question that we will continue to keep in our radars, as we have done up to this point, the use of sexual violence as a crime. And we have reported extensively on illegal detentions, the transfer of civilians, and the treatment of prisoners of war. So, I mean, the agenda, unfortunately, is not short, and we do the best with the resources that we can.
Thank you. So, any other questions?
I think Sarina wanted to ask another question.
There's a request in the chat, Sola.
That was the first one. The second one. Yes, please, Zarina, go ahead.
Thank you so much, and I don't mean to monopolize the conversation. Also, thank you for doing this important work. I can't tell you how important it is to the people of Kherson. I speak to them every day, and the attacks continue every day. Just yesterday, there were several cars, civilian cars attacked. Yesterday, several children were injured. Every day, their house is being burned, and I have recorded it on a daily basis. I actually was hunted by a drone like this, and it's all documented. So I know that it's tremendously important. And my question is, does your commission have plans to have such investigations for other areas in Ukraine, because there are places like Nikopol or villages along the front line in the Sumy region or in the Kharkov region, where also fiber optics drones are used to not just attack civilians, but also start fires. And it amounts, in my opinion, not verified, but documented and reported as ecocide, because the forests are burning. So do you have any such plans? Thank you very much.
Vrinda, could you address that one, please?
Sure. Thank you, Zarina, and thank you for your own documentation that you've been doing as a journalist in very difficult circumstances. When you ask the question about the plans, I think many factors come into play. As was mentioned by Pablo also, yes, we would like to actually investigate, document, and examine more and more of the violations, particularly of the kind that you are mentioning. However, we are constrained by a few real-time factors, one, of course, being access. I don't know if the areas that you are mentioning, whether access is available for investigators. Yes, that was what I sensed in your question. Second, of course, would be the limitation of resources, which, as you know, is a pervasive issue in the UN, but has a very direct impact on how much and what kind of investigations we can undertake. So, as was mentioned by the chair, Erik, right in the beginning, we don't just rely on open source. We do our own investigation. We ensure that the evidence is confirmed, is corroborated, and that requires both access as well as resources. So within those constraints, we will have to structure our work.
Thank you.
And if I may add just one point, Zarina. We are actually carrying out ongoing investigations about the use of drones of a similar type in other localities. So once we acquire competencies in the investigation of certain type of novel type of violation, it is of course not so difficult to deploy it elsewhere. Of course, mindful of the constraints that Vrinda just mentioned, which are also asked about by Vasil in the chat, whether the current situation with the Commission's funding has improved. So Vrinda already made a reference to limitations having to do with budgetary considerations. And I wish that I could tell you that the situation was completely solved. But as you know, the UN in general is facing some challenges, and we are doing the best with the resources that we have and with the very capable team of investigators that we have. And I think that this report that we are presenting today, in which I want to stress that we reach a very strong conclusion about crimes against humanity, is a demonstration of the fact that the Commission, despite its limitation, continues to do its work, continues to investigate new forms of violations, has the technological ability to do very, very rigorous investigations, and that's what we will continue to do.
Thank you, commissioners. So, any other questions? I don't see any raised hands or checking the chat whether there were anything else.
So, since the issue was mentioned about the chat, which I have not been reading, let me just fill in what was just said. So the level of resources has not improved since they were reduced considerably the last year. So we are at the same relatively limited level. But in spite of that, we consider it possible to maintain the quality of our work, even if we have to some extent to limit the broadness of our work.
Thank you. So I am checking again the chat and looking for any raised hand. Anyone else would like to ask a question? No, I don't see any raised hands or anything. So if there are no, let me make a final call for any more questions. And if not, then we will wrap it up. So one thing that I also wanted to say is that the recording of the press conference will be available on the YouTube channel of the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. And I can put in the chat, remind you of the link that I sent in our media advisory, so that we can, if needed, that it will be published almost immediately, I will say. I see also one question from the YouTube channel, because if you remember, we announced that the press conference can be watched via the live stream. So let me double check whether I can get this question. Just a moment. So the question is from the observer, from a journalist, what can be done with these war crimes in terms of international law? I repeat, what can be done with these crimes in terms of international law is the question from a journalist, an observer.
And this is slightly the same question as we had a bit earlier. With other words, it points to accountability. Let me just briefly recall that we are not a court, we are not an accountability mechanism, but we contribute to accountability by providing the facts and making recommendations to prosecutors and courts. And it will then be to these judicial organs to follow up our reports nationally or internationally. There was an element of repetition here, but I still feel that given the question, it is right to make this remark.
If I may just add a detail here. So I think when we speak in generic language, we use the term war crime as a generic term. Perhaps that's how it is posed in the question also. But when we draw legal conclusions in our report, we follow the legal regime, the international law legal regime, and therefore the conclusions which were referred to earlier have been made of crime against humanity, of murder of civilians. And there are different, as we find the necessary evidence, we determine the crime. So regardless of the crime that it is, of course, the accountability mechanism and process would remain the same.
And if I may add just one last point, which will not surprise my fellow commissioners. From the very beginning, we adopted a broad notion of accountability that includes the judicial accountability dimension, which is crucial and for which we provide, we collect and provide evidence. But we also make recommendations about other dimensions of accountability, including, for example, victims' assistance, some forms of institutional responses to, at the very least, mitigate some of the worst consequences of the violations that we report on. And in this case, we have been consistent with this general principle, and we of course recommend that the victims of the drone attacks receive as comprehensive assistance as possible. And we also ask the international community to contribute to both technically and financially defray the costs of providing comprehensive assistance to victims. So these are all dimensions of accountability to which we contribute without being ourselves an accountability mechanism.
Thank you very much again, the commissioners, and we are concluding our press conference. Thank you very much for your participation. As usual, the journalists, I can see some of them who already know the commission. So thank you very much again, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much for
your
everyone's
work.
interest. Thank you.